Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Daniels. And in case you don't know, my name is Robert Levitt. I'm the acting dean of the faculty. And I wanted to thank you all for coming here tonight to this event and lecture by Chris T. Cornelius entitled Future Ancestor. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. As many of you may know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe and means the place on a hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. And as an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. One more thing, before further introductions, I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow we will have an event in recognition of National Truth and Reconciliation Day here in this hall, at which members of the Daniels community will speak and present work done at the Daniels faculty, and we invite members of the Daniels community to join us tomorrow, luncheon at noon and event at 1. Anyway, on to tonight's lecture. Lecture is entitled Future Ancestor, to be given by Chris, who is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and the chair of architecture at the University of New Mexico. He's also a founding principal of Studio Indigenous, through which he creates architecture and artifacts that dismantle stereotypes surrounding Indigenous design, offering a distinct vision of contemporary Indigenous culture in their place. Chris has been a visiting professor at Yale University, at Columbia University, and his awards include the Miller Prize from Exhibit Columbus and multiple Best of Design and Best Practice Awards from the Architect's newspaper. His work has also been exhibited at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale and at the 2023 Chicago Architecture Biennial. In his lecture tonight, Chris will delve into his personal and professional journey, showing the profound impact that his cultural heritage has had on his practice, and including the innovative approach to architecture that honors and integrates Indigenous traditions and values into placemaking. He'll share insights into how Indigenous philosophies, storytelling, and sustainable practices have influenced his design, resulting in structures that are not only aesthetically stunning, that you'll see, but also deeply meaningful to the communities they serve. And then he'll take a few questions, too, from the audience, which I'll start the Q&A after the lecture, and then pass it on to all of you. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Cornelius up to the stage. Welcome.
Thank you. Wat kuf nuela du, Chris Nyungets Aquahoni Wagaituloda, Okale Oniata Aga, Duwagadon Choda. I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. I am a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I was raised on the reservation there. I attended undergraduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and grad school at University of Virginia. For me, I really started to think about what I wanted architecture to be for Indigenous people between the time of undergrad and grad school. And I started to develop this understanding about what architecture should be for Indigenous people. And at that time is when I really formulated this idea of being a future ancestor, thinking about what are the artifacts that we are leaving behind and that I will be leaving behind as a designer. During my entire education as an architect, I never saw anything Indigenous. Nothing Indigenous was presented to me. I knew who Douglas Cardinal was, I knew his work, but other than that, I didn't really know what that would hold and what that would be. So for me, it was about trying to find the parallels between what I was being shown and how I would interpret that as a designer. So I started thinking about this premise, establishing the sort of basis of what I wanted to do. And it really was a response or critique to the work that was being done in the late 20th century. So I thought of this. As an architecture student, I was shown this, The Duck in the Decorated Shed by Venturi and Scott Brown, and understanding what that is. I saw a parallel between that and what I was seeing architecture being done for Indigenous people. So one is the zoomorph. The building looks like an animal. This is the elementary school that was built on my reservation in the mid-90s. Looks like a turtle. It's got eyes made of tile. The gym is in the head. You enter in the armpit, and the kindergarten is in the tail. So I call it that the zoomorph, right? There are other buildings that I'm sure you've seen are turtles and bears and eagles and things like that. And then the pictograph, which is taking Indigenous iconography and applying it to the architecture. And both of these things don't inherently indigenize the architecture. So that's what I was really responding to and thinking about, like, what am I going to present and how am I going to figure this out? Like, how am I going to do this kind of work? And that was the thing that really kind of compelled me. So shortly after graduate school, I was asked to be a part of this project, the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. It's an Indigenous private school, K through 8th grade. Students don't have to pay tuition. They only have to prove Native ancestry to attend the school. They selected Antoine Predock as the design architect, and they asked for an Indigenous designer to be on the design team with him. That was an extraordinary experience for me because it is the thing that I established my practice very early on. I think that if there's a diagram of my career, it's kind of bow tie shaped, right? I started with this huge commission, and then I started doing installations, and now I'm doing bigger projects again. But this entire project for me, and they're still clients of mine today, so we're 21 years later, this entire project for me was the ability to say what Indigenous space is and what is the space for Indigenous people. And it was really founded on values, and that was one of the things that I expressed to Antoine. He's not into using icons and symbols and things like that, but he's into understanding the place and the architecture reflecting that. The tree columns here came from the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's an extraordinary place, and we were trying to root the thing into its setting. So this is one of the graphics that I created early on in the project because I wanted to begin to explain the fact that when we're intervening as designers on the ground, we're actually affecting an entire series of reciprocities, right? So in this case, I wanted to diagram everything from the site all the way up to the moon, to think about what lessons can we learn from the animals that burrow into the earth. This thing has varying vertical scale. Butterflies and geese, what are the migratory patterns of the things that are flying over? Airline traffic, the seasonal winds, where do they happen and what directions are they coming from? Where's space travel? Where are satellites passing over this site all the way up to the moon? And understanding that as a continuity, and that as designers, again, we're intervening in a very complex set of reciprocities. And so I really started to think about this idea, the Indigenous value of relationality. And as you know, this is why we call the earth our mother. We mean that, like literally we're related to that, right? All living things are part of our relation. Stones are our grandfathers. They're just living at a much longer time period than we are. Non-humans are also our relatives, and beginning to think about that. At the time as well, one of the things we did was, because of this complicated relationship between Indigenous people and education, because it was used as a tool of colonization and assimilation, we stripped all the institutional names from the programmatic elements. So the school's been open since 2017. They have never, ever called the place that they eat the cafeteria. It's called Feast. It's not called the lobby, it's called community. It's not the theater, it's called drum. The classrooms, I named the classrooms after things in the exterior, animals, medicines, trees, so students understand their building in that way. But one of the other things to begin to think about, or at least I was thinking about, and the other things that I was learning as an architecture student, was Logier's frontispiece, which is this sort of depiction of the beginnings of architecture, right? So we see the architect pointing at nature, and architecture is emerging out of that, and opposing that with what indigenous architecture is, and that actually being a relationship. So we don't see nature as a commodity, right? Nature is not the raw materials of architecture. It's actually a relationship. So how is that thing related to the place that it's being put? And how are we relating to that, right? In this, I think on the right, it's saying more that nature is mine, right? Mine to possess, to use, to process, to build things, to use as a resource. But on the left is nature is me. I'm actually a part of this. To think about ourselves as actually being a part of that relationship and being part of that entire process. So in indigenous cultures, we often talk about plants as being our oldest relatives. They're the relatives that they've seen drought. Some are medicines, some are food. They've seen good growing seasons. They've seen bad growing seasons. I believe that we should be thinking about buildings as our youngest relatives. We should be thinking about buildings as our relatives as well, because if it is a living thing, it breathes, it produces waste, it sweats, it does all kinds of things, right? And it can be troublesome, it can use a lot of resources, it can do all of these things. But if we're thinking about it, and this is how I think about it, I'm putting a relative into the world. How am I birthing this thing, and how am I taking care of it, and how is it making its place better, and not just seeing it as a site or context that I'm putting this thing within. So I believe that we should be thinking about buildings as a relatives, and we would think about them differently. In 2018, I did this installation called The Trickster. I was selected for this residency program at this children's literature garden, which in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee. So students come to this, or young adults really come to this place, and they have different places where they learn about different sort of literary sources that children are usually exposed to. So in this one, I wanted to play off and understand the role of the trickster in indigenous storytelling. So sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's some other entity. It changes from nation to nation, and depending on where you are sort of environmentally. But the trickster is really important in the sense that we learn about our own humanity from the trickster. We learn basically what not to do. We learn about greed and gluttony and vanity and those kinds of things because we see the consequences of it from the trickster. That is the important sort of role there. And the interesting thing to me was that as a child, when I heard certain stories, especially trickster-type stories, they're very entertaining because the animal is entertaining, it's doing things, right? But as you grow and mature, you understand those stories differently. And that was one of the things that I was really sort of thinking about here. So it intentionally doesn't have a program, doesn't have a particular use. What I wanted to happen, and it did happen, that young people would come to this place and they would tell their own stories about it. I asked this young woman about what she thought this thing was. She didn't know I was making it, but she said, well, this looks like it came from the woods and the animals made it and then humans came later, or it's from some movie that I haven't seen yet. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what it is. Because it also doesn't have to stand for one thing, right? And that was one of the things I was thinking about indigenous architecture as well, that everything doesn't have to be a symbol or a metaphor for one thing. And we know that indigenous knowledge is not structured that way. Multiple things can be true at the same time, right? It can be a structure. It can be a place to gather. It can be a character. Is this thing moving when I'm not looking at it? Does it like pictures? So the other thing is I started to think about the trickster as its own character. And so when I won this award from the Architects newspaper, they have a sort of word limit of what you produce. And I just described, this is what it is, this is where it is, this is what it's made out of. But then I started talking about the trickster. That the trickster is on stolen land, and the trickster always remembers, the trickster never forgets. It allowed me to start to speak through the thing. And in that way, it became its own thing. I started to think about the thing itself as a sort of living thing. It came out of this exploration of models that I did a series of models when I didn't have any commissioned work. I was also thinking about this idea, like, I don't want everything to be a symbol or a metaphor for everything, right? So I just started making these things, and the only thing I was really sort of concerned with was, I don't want to use people as the scale figures in this thing. I'm only going to use animals, and I'm not going to be clear about who made it and why they made it. But we understand that whatever made this thing has some tacit understanding of nature and how it sort of works. But I also started to think about indigenous regalia. Why can't architecture have regalia too? The regalia itself is not just aesthetic, and it's not just symbolic. It's all of those things, right? So on the right, there's a Gastoy from the Mohawk, Haudenosaunee. I'm Oneida, so I'm one of the Haudenosaunee nations. But I know that it's Mohawk because of the feather configuration, right? I know that it has 2 feathers up. If it had 2 feathers up and 1 feather down, I would know it was Oneida. If it had 1 feather up, I would know it's Onondaga. I know that this is a chief's Gastoy because it has antlers. So it's in that way, when I see these things, my brain can interpret who this person is and where they belong. What if architecture could do a similar thing to that? So the piece was at this literature garden for almost 2 years, and I made it from trees that were harvested on the site. And I just thanked the trees for giving their lives for this piece, and was very happy to have it there for that period of time. So these friends of mine from Spirit of Space, they make films. They sent me an email one day and were like, Chris, we want to go film the thing in the snow. And I was like, yes, do that, please. They made this really amazing film about the piece. The thing that I love about the way that they made it, one, it's only a minute long, so it's like a trailer. The other is that they filmed it in a way that feels like if you get too close to it, you might scare it off. But you ultimately befriend the thing. And it also showed me things about the regalia that I made on the thing. I never thought about these things that I put on it reflecting the pine needles immediately. I never thought about that. And they started to sort of make me think about that as well. The year before is when I won the Miller Prize, the first Miller Prize from Exhibit Columbus, and I did this piece called Wikiami. I wanted to acknowledge the indigenous land that Columbus, Indiana is on, right? Columbus in its very name is about colonization. Indiana as a state, I think it was like the 3 treaties. It only took 3 treaties to basically swipe all of the land. And we were assigned these sites. So I was assigned the site of First Christian Church, and that is Elio Saarinen and Eero Saarinen had started to practice together. This was the first sort of modernist church in the U.S. If you don't know about Columbus, Indiana, it's an amazing place. It has, I think, the most modernist buildings in the U.S. One of I.M. Pei's first projects is across the street, the library. Just down the street is a bank by Eero Saarinen. And this particular project, because it was done in the early 40s, they had to get special permission to use the steel to actually finish the project because the U.S. was at war at that time. But I wanted to reflect this notion that the people that were indigenous to that land, the Miami or Miami, were wigwam building culture. And that's what they sort of dwelt in. And a lot of Great Lakes region nations had this sort of culture. They're very sophisticated structures. They're really technically savvy. because they're made out of these saplings that are bent over, and they create this dome shape, and they're either clad in bark or cattail reed mats. And the cattail itself is insulative because it has air within it, and so if you begin to sew these things together, they make these insulative things. There are also structures, like many indigenous structures, that you can have a fire in and it doesn't fill with smoke. And that was the thing that I was really kind of thinking about, because I wanted the people to think about the land that they're on. And I intentionally do not replicate shapes or forms. What I'm trying to do is to understand what was it that shape or form came from. I do feel like that way of working where there's form to form and you just make the form bigger and you put seats in it and windows and enclose it isn't the sort of answer for making indigenous architecture. It's understanding the values that particular form had and the materials that it was being made from. So I thought about this idea of the wood, and in this case I'm using steel rebar, this sort of ubiquitous material that we don't always see. And instead of bending things over, I decided to bend things up, and I clad it in this sheathing that I call its feathers of an expanded metal. So this thing was there on the site for 2 years, and I allowed it to rust and patina over time. The top of it is angled towards the fall equinox, and they had a storytelling session in it. That's the time when there's the most light in it. And again, it didn't have any particular program, but people just used it in different ways. For storytelling, there was a indigenous language revitalization group that came into it. There was a dance company that actually choreographed a piece around it. But I really wanted to think about this thing. And the top of it also has that regalia. So I'm thinking about it communicating with the Saarinen in a way that I don't understand or know, but how can I facilitate that conversation as a designer? Just a few years ago, I was asked to do this piece as a permanent land acknowledgement on Lawrence University in Wisconsin. It's a small liberal arts college in Appleton, Wisconsin. That university is sort of comprehensively, I guess in a way, and they're starting here to begin to think about the fact that their campus is on Menominee land. They're the tribe that was largely indigenous to that place. And so they allowed me to select the site. I selected the site on the plaza that's in the sort of main quad area. The thing that I do this in most of my projects, some form of community engagement, but I really talk to the indigenous students that are on that campus. They come from all over the country. That university has a program where they have indigenous students come to this summer camp. They call it, I think, College Horizons, where they basically are teaching indigenous students how to go to college and what that actually means. But they told me that they don't see anything indigenous in their campus. Nothing reflects them as a physical space. So I was really thinking about that. If we look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, this dark green area is the land that the Menominee are on. And their reservation is that rectangle up there. It looks like it's a glitch or a Photoshop, but it's because they have always sustainably harvested their land. Over the past 100 years, they have raised the yield of that land by 125 to 140% because they only harvest the trees that fall naturally. They only harvest trees that are getting in the way of other trees. They have a very sophisticated forestry management plan that is just really an extraordinary example of how we should be doing this. In that way, because they don't harvest to meet a yield, an annual yield, whatever the yield is what is brought out of that. But now that has made that wood very valuable. It gets used for fine furniture. I wouldn't be surprised if something like this is made out of that. Basketball floors and things like that are all made out of that wood. So this is where Lawrence University sits, almost in the heart of that, within that land. And this one is called Otichea. So I worked with a Menominee friend of mine. What should I call this thing? And when I title these things, for me it's important that they do have a title. The second thing is that I don't work from title to thing. I work from thing, and then the thing tells me what it kind of wants to be. So I'm not working this sort of symbol way or symbolic way. But Otechea is a crane, and that's one of their clans, and that clan is in charge of art and architecture. I I think that's extraordinary. I don't know of a lot of indigenous cultures that actually have a clan and that's their responsibility. But that's that thing. The other thing is that the name itself, being a Menominee, I started thinking about this, that the land, if we think about this, for thousands of years had heard indigenous languages, and then it stopped. The land doesn't hear indigenous languages. So whether that indigenous language is coming from indigenous people or non-indigenous people, it needs to hear it, right? So the title of the thing, people are saying it, because there's a little plaque there. People are saying it, and the land can hear that. I feel like that was an important thing. And so now these indigenous students have a place to gather. They have a place that if they want to have a demonstration, protest, or whatever it is, they see themselves and understand that that's who they are, and that place reflects them, and they have a place to go. This more recent project, I was one of 5 practices asked to participate in this exhibition at Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, Bentonville, Arkansas. It's an amazing art museum, and they wanted to do this exhibition called Architecture at Home, and so they allowed each of us to kind of think about what home was. So I started thinking about there's a really complex history of that part of the country, because it's actually on the path of the Trail of Tears between Florida and Oklahoma. But I started to think about indigenous housing in general, and the house that I grew up in on my reservation, the HUD house. And so what I wanted to do was to make a thing that wasn't what I grew up in, and so that's why I call it Not My HUD House. So like the trickster, I started to think about all of the things that my HUD house didn't have. My HUD house didn't have a porch. It didn't have a garage. It didn't have a place for me to study. It didn't have a view of the sky. It didn't have a place for a fire. It didn't have any of these things. And so when we look at indigenous housing, and this was from a studio I taught at Yale, so one of my students, Ben Thompson, made this sort of mapping of this condition that I was describing. And so our studio was focused on the Opaskwayak Cree Nation in Manitoba, but I started to explain to him, you'll see this house in Manitoba, you'll see it in South Dakota, you'll see it in Arizona. It's the same house, almost literally the same house. And so I added my house. That's the house I grew up. This is just like I just copy and pasted the Google Street View, right? Because I don't have great photos of it. To be honest, when I was a kid, it didn't seem photograph worthy, so I never took a picture of it. But what I noticed, without really knowing, this had more to do with me being an architect than I knew. I went to school off the reservation with non-indigenous people. Our high school was about 20% indigenous, so our reservation, you went to one of 2 high schools. But when I rode my bike to my friend's house, which was 10 miles away, so I ride my bike every day in the summer, 10 miles, 20 miles there and back, I just noticed that their houses were different. They had sidewalks, they had trees, they were close together, they were lined up, they had backyards. We didn't have any of that. And I was like, what is wrong with where I live? There's something wrong with it. And so that's when I started thinking about, I've got to do something about that. The other thing the house didn't have, this one does, we didn't have gutters on the thing, and so the water just shot off the roof and started to make the basement leak. And then the housing that's in Manitoba, it's the same house, but it's raised off the ground. So what that means is that the ground, when it freezes, there's a temperature differential between those things, right? And it's creating moisture and mold in their houses. And so there's photos that I know people in that community. They sent me photos where people are just building snow around their home because they insulate it, right? They've just kind of figured it out. But that is happening everywhere. And so that was the thing that I was responding to. So this is a plan of a house that's just from South Dakota. It's almost exactly the same floor plan of the house that I grew up in. I think this is a slightly fancier version because it has 2 bathrooms. There's a main bath along with the other bath. But I had to, my room, I could only fit a twin bed in it. How was I supposed to, there's no desk or thing for me to, how was I supposed to succeed in that setting? And almost all of these homes have the same floor plan, same elevation. The other fundamental thing about them is that when this started to happen in the 50s, people started to think, well, if Indigenous people just lived like post-war America in a 3-bedroom nuclear home, then they'll be more civilized and take care of things. No, we've never lived like that, right? We've never had like bedroom, living room, kitchen. We've had one room, and that room was a place of ceremony, it was a place of government, it was a place of making, it was a place of eating, it was a place for all of these things. And so that separation is one of the things that I started to really think about in this project as well. So I also started to think about the fact that my home didn't have a place for my non-human relatives. Is there a place that we can cohabitate together? And so, again, I'm using animals as scale figures here. But this is the piece. It was fabricated out of great fabricators from Indianapolis called Ignition Arts. Then they developed a system where it's basically a flat pack system. So everything that came to the site was all CNC plywood. It was like 4 pallets of plywood. And we pulled it out like jigsaw puzzles, and it just went together. But the fundamental thing here is that I wanted it to be constructed easily. And then I really started to think, well, this is for an installation. But you could actually build homes in this way. And the fact that our homes are multi-generational, so in my family, my grandmother, when her husband passed away, my step-grandfather, she came and lived with us for months. Like, I slept on the couch, she slept in my bed. That happens all the time. You can have 2, 3, 4 generations in a home, because if you have adult children and they have children, they come into this. So taking a modular approach to this, where a community could get together and build a module and put it on or take it off. Like maybe my grandmother wanted her own home that was on the property. So I started to think about that. And then again, I started to think about this idea of the regalia and the architecture having the regalia of our culture. So I put jingles on it. I decided to do this because there were all these tabs on it from the CNC that the way the thing went together is that these tabs were CNC'd so that they actually held the sheathing on. But then I started to think, well, I should do something with those tabs, and so I decided to put jingles on it. I didn't have the budget to make a big sort of fireplace, the hearth, so I made the steel frame to take the place of that, and then I used the copper mesh cladding that I put on the Trickster. I made a second Trickster on another exhibition, so I reused that copper, and it's sitting in my house right now. I'm waiting for the next thing to put it on. But I started to really think about, yes, the fire is important because it is about ceremony, it's about cooking, it's about council, it's about so many things, and why can't we have a place for that fire to occur within it? Within the space. So this is the interior of it. It has a hole in the top. I think we should always have a view to the sky. Indigenous people kind of need, I think anyone, to be honest, anyone needs a view to the sky. And so if we started to look historically at Indigenous architecture, that's the quality that I'm trying to get. Right? I'm trying to get that as a quality in the place. So our Haudenosaunee longhouses were really sort of understood by how many smoke holes it had or how many fires it had, right? And so I'm thinking about that as the sky hole instead of the smoke hole. I'm also bringing in light from low, from high, so that it starts to animate. But it's really just one space. This could be the living room. It could be where someone makes something. It could be where people come together and eat. It could be added onto. All of those things could occur within the piece. So we did this rendering before the project, and I have a former student of mine that works on the renderings with me. And so I started to talk about the deer, and I said, well, the deer should be on the porch because the deer should feel like it's actually welcome in this particular place. And he put these little deer tracks on the rendering. When I was making the thing, installing it, I found this. I went to the site and found this. There are deer tracks that lead up to the porch and then they disappear. So that means that the deer either got on the porch and went somewhere else, got on the porch, went into the thing. This is where I feel like I'm being a good relative, right? My relatives are not afraid of this thing. As architects, we spend so much time and effort trying to keep animals off our buildings and all the nixolite things that are trying to keep birds off of buildings. We should be cohabitating. The things that we're making should actually be a part of that. So that's why these little shelves are around the windows so birds can sort of nest within them and beginning to think about what that is and how our relatives see the piece itself. So in 23, I was asked to design a space for Indigenous ceramics. There's an Indigenous ceramics exhibition. This is at the Milwaukee Art Museum with the Chipstone Foundation, which is a smaller museum. They have exhibition space within that museum. And I really started to think about this idea. Again, I'm trying not to make these kind of metaphors. And I said the title of the thing, I was kind of a co-curator too, because I talked to the artists and I named the exhibition Knowledge Beings. I didn't want anything to do with fire. I didn't want anything to do with clay. Like that just seems like a trope, right, when it comes to ceramics. But what I wanted to think about was, because one of the artists started to tell me about her pieces, that these were actually beings, that they were like living things that she had made that were now sort of ambassadors of where she came from, that was going to be in this thing. And that a lot of the artists talked about the knowledge that is in these pieces. It's usually ancestral knowledge of how to make these things, but then the artists make it their own. Like, what does it mean to them as a contemporary artist? So we selected 13 pieces to be in the exhibition. This is the sort of entry of the thing. I also wanted this thing to be immersive. I wanted you to come into this thing. I didn't want a white box. I didn't want pedestals with acrylic boxes on it. I didn't want tombstones for, like, this is the thing, this is who made it, like all that registrar stuff that is important but can get in the way. And so what I did was I made 13 homes for each of these pieces. This is the 13th piece, and this is Nora Naranjo Morris. And she's the one that talked about these things, like they were beings. And even I was there when they were shipped to the Chipstone, and we had a talk face-to-face about it. And she really just treated these like these were her children, and that she was sending them off because now that museum had acquired them. But I felt like, okay, I need to make a place that is really a home for these pieces. And that view to the sky, because I can't literally make it in the museum. This isn't an exhibition space. It's really sort of buried in the museum. I decided to do this projection of the sky. And the projection in the sky, and I call this the sky hole, the projection goes through 24 hours within 20 minutes. So each time you come there, it might be a little different. It might be night, there might be northern lights, there might be something else within the piece. And so each of these 13 pieces has a home within the piece. I don't want to get into the nerdy rhino stuff that I do, but I really started to think about this thing as a carved thing. I started with the space as being full, and then carving out these homes for these pieces, and really thinking about the sky being the thing that's above these other sort of knowledge keepers. So these are just photos of the different versions of the sky. Sounds complicated, but it's really kind of not. So there's a projector above that, and the lighting in the pieces, the vitrines of where the actual things are, they adjust to the lighting that's coming from the projector. So when it's dark, they raise the level, and when it's bright, they lower the level. And I was, again, thinking about a person and how they are going to encounter each of these things. So some of them you can get close to, but I made these benches that were carved into the thing. I didn't want the sort of standard museum bench, but to think about the fact that you could sit in this bench and start to think about the things that you were seeing and reflecting on it. So this is the rest of the museum. That's what I was trying to avoid with the design of this particular thing. And then each of these vitrines, the objects are lit from above and below. Ceramics are interesting in that in many of these pieces, the bottom of the thing is actually as important as the top. So illuminating both sides of it was really important. So each of them has this sort of home within the exhibition. We changed the flooring in it. It's a cork flooring, so when you step into the thing, your brain might not sort of register that, but just understanding that you're in a different kind of space. So after that piece, I was fortunate to be asked to do this for the Gardner Museum here. they are renovating the museum. They are going to have a specific Indigenous ceramics exhibition space, and so they've asked me to design that piece. So when you enter the museum, I have the two vitrines here sort of ghosted, but you'll see this thing. And again, I wanted to make a sort of experiential thing, but in this case, it's not inside a room, it's a freestanding thing. So I think about it as a vessel. I've given it this Oneida name, which is Ilaqua, which means one uses it to be in. And that was interesting to me as a language. I'm not a fluent speaker, but to me it was interesting as a language thing that it wasn't just a utilitarian thing like a vessel, like a basket or a piece of pottery. It was you're in the thing, and that's a part of I think the way that at least the way that I'm thinking about this thing. So it's made out of a frame of CLT that is kind of freestanding within the museum space. The top of it just sort of kisses the top of there's a baffle ceiling that will run through the new renovation. So in the cross section, there are two vitrines on either side that will get filled. Again, I'm thinking about the bench as actually being important and actually being functional and has another use. So you can sit on it. The opening of the thing is it comes down, probably comes down to about this height. So if you are visually impaired and have a cane so you don't hit your head on the low part, you hit the bench. So I'm trying to use the bench as a functional thing too, but to really think about it as a continuous thing, you can see it actually kind of goes into the space and holds up the vitrine. It's not literally doing that, but it looks as if it does. So I was thinking about it as a basket. I was thinking about Haudenosaunee basketry, but not in a literal way. If you know it, it's really complex, and this is one of the things that I'll probably keep thinking about. When you take form and you twist it and start making other forms in space and integrating handles, it's really amazing. And so I was just thinking about that, like how can I make entry to this thing, and that the thing is seen as an object as well. So it will appear freestanding, but it's connected to these two columns. The ceiling in this case also has a sky hole. We're going to use the same exact film that's in the Milwaukee exhibition. I just really think that it's important to me that people are looking at the same sky at the same time in two different locations. So again, this is what the film, it has these noises and you hear birds. There's a kind of white noise about the wind. That will happen within this thing. And so a similar effect will happen where there's low light, when it's night and you see the northern lights, and then there's bright sky within the piece as well. But for me, it was really important that this is a thing that you can get inside of, you can begin to understand the pieces that you're seeing, and that will begin to really think about where Indigenous ceramics sort of situate themselves, so that it's not just like sort of genre, subgenre, whatever you want to call, category of ceramics, but it's actually artifact. And that those artifacts, this is really important to me, that those artifacts are not done and over with, which is how museums treat Indigenous content. But there are people still making these things right now. And people are still doing it in the same way. And that was really sort of important to me to begin to think about as a sort of designer and person thinking about how these things are seen and exhibited in museums. The piece I did for the Chicago Architecture Biennial is called Guidaze, which in Oneida means stranger. So instead of making a land acknowledgement and trying to speak for the people that are indigenous to Chicago, the Potawatomi, I just wanted to say that I'm an indigenous person and I am a stranger in that land too. I'm Oneida, so it has an Oneida name. I'm a stranger in that land too. While we're both indigenous, I might understand certain things, but this is not my land as well. This is an animation that shows in the sky. I filmed this in my backyard. One of the things to me that's just amazing about living in New Mexico is the sky. It's just extraordinary. It's sunny, just like sunny for like 300 days of the year. and it's really amazing. So this one has, I call it the sky chimney. So the video of that sky and some other ones sort of loop through. But I also started to think about the regalia and expanding upon it, and thinking about the way that we as architects and designers sort of apply materials, right? We can do it sort of diagrammatically, like certain materials are certain programmatic things, or surfaces are treated one way and it changes the corner and it's another thing. But what if it just sort of disregarded all of that? And I started to think about this thing being chopped into pieces. And so it has different sort of materials on each of the pieces. There's deer hides on one piece. There are the jingles on this, like the Not My HUD House, but they're more extensive. The jingles on this one are actually a star mapping. So where the stars are brighter, there's just more jingles. Some spots there's 2 jingles or 3 jingles, and they are the indexing of that. And then the other piece has these deer hides clad onto the frame, so when you're inside the thing, you can see the frame, you can see the inside. Because in this way, I'm really just thinking about what if literally I thought about buildings as animals and how they blend into their environment, right? If I take this animal, the deer, I can begin to think about what that actually is. It's not just about the coloration of the thing, it's the fact that that thing has given me a gift, and now I have received that and am using it in the cladding of this thing. So each of the pieces have a name, so I'm thinking about them in these sort of analogical ways. The haunch is where the deer hides are, the tail is where the jingles are, and the carapace is where the white part is. On the inside of the white part is this sort of paint that is kind of luminescent, so it's like a pearling sort of white color, kind of like the inside of a turtle shell. And so you can see this piece was really, I had, again, worked with these amazing fabricators that made this thing. And I am really just sort of unapologetically an architect, right? Like, I like making forms, and I like making openings, and I like to see what those openings can do. So instead of just punching a hole in the thing, right, I've recessed part of it, or I've cut through the recess so that you know that these pieces are separate from one another. I wanted people to get inside. I want a place to sit. And this is the sky chimney that's, you can see the video that runs through the sky chimney, and the inside of it has that pearlescent paint. You can see it a little bit on this. So thinking about the inside of a turtle's shell. So I started thinking about this idea of what design actually is. And one of the things that I think, if I can impart anything upon you, Indigenous architecture is not a style, it's not a type. I can't give you a cookbook, a recipe to do it, right? We can kind of do that with like postmodernism. These things make this postmodern. Indigenous architecture doesn't work that way. And one of those like amazing things about working with these other Indigenous architects for the Venice Biennale was I just started to see we see the world differently because we're different people, we're from different places. So we're not all making the same kind of architecture, right? And the thing that was really extraordinary to me about Douglas Cardinal was, like, he has a design language that is his own, and he sort of resisted this sort of like, he didn't make any concrete teepees or whatever, right? But it was his own, and it was important to him that it is received in the world of architecture, and that was my goal, is to be similar in that way. So I started to think about this idea of design is ceremony. After I read Sean Wilson's book, Research is Ceremony. This is an extraordinary book. I just like, right now, his book sales may have ticked up, and I'm probably responsible for it, because I tell everyone to read this thing. And the thing that he does within the book, and I know his sister, and I know his parents. They're really just amazing people. The thing he does in the book is he shows you what the Indigenous research paradigm is. But he does it through this Western lens, right? Because he has a PhD in education. So he talks about epistemology, he talks about ontology, he talks about axiology and methodology. We know what these things are, but what he does is talk about them as an indigenous person. What is that through an indigenous lens? And it kind of breaks down into just what knowing is, what being is, what you value, and how are you doing it. And so this is the thing that I'm trying to do with my work. None of that has to do with the form, shape, whatever, right? Patterns, colors. It just has to do with this idea of being indigenous. So I believe that really indigenous architecture has to come from indigenous people. And in understanding, if we think about this framework that he has created, an indigenous designer can touch all of these things. Like, if we think about this as a diagram, this is 100% touching all of those things. And a non-indigenous designer can't. So what I'm saying is that indigenous architecture comes from indigenous people. If it's a non-indigenous designer, maybe there's a little bit of knowing, a little bit of being, and a little bit of valuing. Like, you can understand those things, but you just don't understand it in the same way as being indigenous. And the methodology, however, you can understand maybe a little more. You can understand like how stories are told, how those artifacts are important, how those structures are important to the people. But it's not indigenous architecture, it's architecture for indigenous people. In the US, indigenous arts are protected federally by saying that if you can't say that something is made, or you can't say that this is Native American unless a Native American made it, right? That's just the terminology that they use. I think architecture should be included in that we shouldn't be saying that it's indigenous architecture unless it's coming from indigenous minds. You might have indigenous consultants, but I think this is where, to me, the importance of training indigenous architects is really fundamental. It's really important for indigenous people to actually be trained as architects, to understand all of this, to begin to think about that. So when I teach indigenous content to non-indigenous people, I'm always using this as the framework for understanding what they're doing. Now, I do think that we should be training just architects to understand this, because I believe that this can hold true of other cultures, and I'll say that they're cultures with a small c, right? A corporation, a campus, a business, a group, a church, whatever, they have their own cultures and understanding. So understanding what they value, how they do it, what does it mean to be a part of that group, and the methodologies that they use, those are all really just important things. So when I read it, I was just like, this is about design and how this is what I'm trying to do, and beginning to think about it and explain it in that way. And so I'm also talking about to students. I'm actually teaching a class for the first time now, just called Indigenous Space, where we're reading things like this, and I explain to them, you're not going to get the cookbook or recipe by taking this course. What you are going to get is an understanding of the world, so that you can begin to think about how you might design differently. But we started talking about decolonization, and reading decolonization is not a metaphor, right? To me, the term decolonization is almost like diversity. Everyone's using it. I love diversity. I'm for diversity. But what are you really doing about it, right? And so to me, I write it in this way because it's an active project. And we're never going to get to 100% of it. But we have responsibilities as people, humans, existing in the world, of how we're going to get there. But we have to understand what it is, right? And so Linda Tuhawe Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, she explains the vocabulary of colonialism. One of them is the line, right? The map, survey, or territory. You draw a line around this thing. For us, it was the 13 colonies, Louisiana Purchase, the United States. Like, drawing these borders around the thing is really important. Then you establish the center, or the orientation to the system of power. You make the capital, right? The Romans put a church in the middle. Like, that kind of understanding of the power. And then this outside, that the inside and outside are in oppositional relation to each other. I'm inside, you're outside, build a wall, keep them out, there's a border. All of that stuff is part of colonization. The intriguing thing to me, too, about this was that we use these terms in architecture all the time. And I think the fundamental thing here is really about like thinking about the separation of things, right? Right and wrong, good and bad, valid, not valid, true, false. Like that's all part of the framework of colonization. And if we start to think about, at least for me, it was really important to think about building a scaffolding around it so that I can dismantle it and reassemble it. At the same time, if I build the scaffolding around it, I can invite others in to assist. It's like Obi-Wan Kenobi had to get into the Death Star, turn off the protection so that they could destroy the thing. That's what really what it is that I'm trying to do. But for me, I think that colonization, I mean, we're all subject to it. It's just, for Indigenous people, it's just kind of way more acute. But, because we're the ones that have been colonized. But the thing that fuels colonization, that it thrives on, that keeps it going, perpetuates it, is a lack of empathy. If we're not thinking about each other in whatever way that means, it will continue to happen. Like, I don't assume everyone in this room got to this point in your life at the same time, and just the same, you shouldn't think about me, right? Like, yeah, I went to UVA, but you don't even know what it was like growing up in that HUD house. Like, I escaped danger, right? Like, that was not a part, that my grandmother survived a residential school. Like, what? This was 2 generations away. So just understanding, and that's what I just fundamentally try to do as an administrator and a professor, is to understand that that student situation is unique to them, and how can I help them? How can I make this a better place for them? When I went through architecture school, it was like, this is the GPA you need this portfolio, you need these GRE scores, you need these grades, like this is how you do it. Because otherwise, no one else can do it, right? And I just feel like it's a fundamental thing that's flawed with architecture, is like they're so protective of who can do it and who can't. But all of that is fueled by this lack of empathy. And so that is the thing that I try to think about, especially when I'm educating young architects, is how can I make more empathetic designers? And so I hope that you're thinking about that as well. So this last project I'll talk about is really a research project that I started a few years ago. And I really started to think about the occupation of Alcatraz Island that happened from November of 1969 to June of 71. And I had a friend once that he basically said that we should always think about what was happening in the world when we were born. That was happening in the world when I was born. This is a really important time in Indigenous resistance and protest, right? Because what they had done is they had occupied Alcatraz Island because it was federal surplus land. And the Treaty of Fort Laramie said that you can have whatever land the government deems as surplus, decommissioned as a prison. So these students, Indigenous students from San Francisco, occupied the island for this entire time. But the thing that was really super interesting to me is that they didn't want it for like political gain or economic goals or whatever. They wanted an Indigenous college, university. They wanted an Indigenous cultural center, Indigenous environmental center. They wanted architecture, right? That's like profound to me. So that's what I was really kind of thinking about with this thing. And then on the island, the graffiti is really important. This is from one of the buildings. This is my favorite thing, from one of the buildings. And what they did was they began to use this graffiti to sort of reappropriate this island, right? So what they did was they erased every reference to the United States, the federal property. They just called it Indian land. And some of that graffiti is still there. It's still on the island. It's a national park now. But it was also a place where I think it was the Hopi, could have been Dene people, were actually like shipped to this island because they weren't like learning their language. They cut their hair. They tried to teach them English. Like it was used as that. And it was also a Civil War sort of fort during the Civil War. The North were afraid that if the South got a navy, they could come into San Francisco Bay and get all the gold that everyone was finding in California. So it has this really interesting history when we start to think about all of those things. But when I started to think about all of the complexities of this project, so I wrote this grant proposal where I was going to design the Indigenous University that's going to exist on this island and coexist with it as a national park. But then I really started to think, this is so complex. If I really just start to think about what this means and how did they get to that point in history to occupy it, and what does it mean for me as a 21st century designer? So I had to draw in a different way. For me, I had to draw to understand this. And so I started to make these thematic drawings, and this one is called trajectories. And so I started by drawing every edge of every building that was on it. And so all of the buildings on the southern end, those were like dormitories. The weird thing is like the people that worked, the prison guards and their families lived on the island with the world's most, or at least the nation's most dangerous people. That was all burned down because they didn't want people to occupy it again after the occupation. But then I started to think about all these other trajectories, airline traffic, the ferry traffic that goes through there, how they surveyed the West Coast before there was any GPS. They did it with these long lines of triangulation. But I also started to think about how can I embed Indigenous histories into these drawings as well. So I started to think about trajectories of death, right? The trajectories of colonization, the trajectories of assimilation when people were walked from the Carolinas and Florida to Oklahoma, which is that dark spot that they called the Indian Territory, right? This is before the U.S. had fully sort of migrated that to that part. And then I also drew the map of the path that my people took from New York State to Wisconsin through Canada, where the Six Nations are, and thinking about that as a trajectory as well. So anything that came into my mind as a trajectory I was drawing it in this. I believe that when we are designing things that, at least the way that I was taught, it's like conceive of the thing, then you draw the thing, then you build a model of the thing, and then you do drawings of the thing, and then the thing gets built. But I think we're trying to make interesting things. We should think about the other ways, cognitive ways that our brain works. So for me, it's like if it comes into my brain, it went into the drawing. I didn't really try to figure out what it meant or what it is or why it exists. But if it was a kind of trajectory, it went into the drawing. This one is called Territories. So I had all these maps from my research. There was a grant that I got, so I went to the National Park Archives. I got all kinds of geology maps, landscape maps, planting maps, how the infrastructure works. There's actually a tunnel on the front end of the island so that if the prisoners escaped one of these buildings, the guards could run through. Actually, the park rangers that were there when I went there were really just amazing. The public can't go into that tunnel. They took me into the tunnel. They took me into these other buildings. But I really just started to think again about how territories are claimed and understood, and how we began to think about them. So these drawings, I should say that I draw them on Mylar. I'm drawing on the front. I'm drawing on the back. When you're looking at it, you're usually looking at 3 or 4 layers. This is how I was taught to draw and make things in the 90s in architecture school. But I also started to think about land secession, and I really just examined South Dakota and Wisconsin, where I'm from. South Dakota has this really interesting history for sure, because this large zone was what the U.S. government made a treaty and said, this is your land. And beginning to say, okay, well, you can't have that, then you can have this. Well, you can't have that, but you can have this. So it shrinks to the federal reservations boundaries that are in yellow. My people, when we moved from New York to Wisconsin in 1822, we purchased this much of the state with the Menominee tribe. This before Wisconsin was a state. We bought that land. And then the federal government came in and made a treaty and said, well, you can't have that. 1831, we can have that little gray area. Then we purchased that land at that time. 1838, the federal reservation boundary is made for my people, the Oneida, and that's that little yellow rectangle. We then paid for all of that land. So we were existing on land we paid for 3 times. And then in the late 1800s, the Dawes Act happens, where they allotted all the land, and any of the land they couldn't allot to people, to tribal members, they would sell, They didn't tell people you had to pay tax on it, so they would repossess it and sell it. My reservation crosses 2 county lines. There's an entire incorporated municipality in the very middle of it. The eastern edge of it overlaps Green Bay proper, so it's in a city. There's a Walmart in Green Bay that's on our land, and they actually lease the land from us. But this idea that, and then, so we at that time, like when Wisconsin became a state, we probably owned like 5% of the land. It's really a small amount. So now we have, this idea of land. This is what I think we should be teaching in architecture school. We should know the Dawes Act like we know the Constitution, because it's how we got to where we are, right? The land is property, and it's not our relative. It is our relative. And this idea of land ownership doesn't like civilize anyone or make you a part of whatever. But my tribe has, there's land that's in trust, meaning like it's part of the reservation within that boundary. And then there's fee land, which when it comes up for sale, we usually try to purchase that. But not every nation has that, the resources to do that. But I started really thinking about that, the complexity of that. And I just wanted to kind of draw that. So you can see that layer underneath this. But I also started to think about things like Acoma Pueblo. In architecture school, we do it at UNM. We should be doing it everywhere. The first cities in the U.S. are here. They're pueblos. The first multi-story buildings in the U.S. are pueblos. The first infrastructural systems, pueblos. Right? This is an amazing place, and it still exists in this way. And you have to be invited to get on top of that mesa to visit that. So I think we should be talking about that in architecture schools. We should be talking about Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonita. This is masonry that rivaled what the Romans were doing, and there's no way they could have communicated with each other. It's super sophisticated. They made round masonry buildings. So we should be talking about that in our building technology courses. They figured out ways how to make wood lintels. There's no wood around here. They had to drag that from hundreds of miles away. All of that should be taught in our building technology courses. And then petroglyphs were a way, these are all over the Southwest. They're ways of claiming territory, right? Telling stories, and those things are preserved in different ways. But in the drawing of these things, I had to also think about the very complex parts of Indigenous history between the U.S. and Indigenous people. How was I going to draw, depict, or think about that? So I decided to index that with the date 12/29/1890. This is just to give the background of that. So 1874, Custer led an expedition into South Dakota and the Black Hills, and they found gold in 1874. In 1876, that's when the Battle of Greasy Grass happened, Custer's last stand. This is when the people sort of revolted and said, no, this is actually our land. You're the aggressors here. We're protecting our territory, the Black Hills, because they're sacred to us. In 1877, as I showed those things shrinking and shrinking, the U.S. came in and then confiscated the land. Not because they wanted to, protect people, it was because of the gold. It was because of the gold. In 1877. So in 1890, after that, over 300 Lakota people were massacred, unarmed. They were dancing. Most of that 300 were women and children. The men were out fighting the U.S. government. So these gentlemen here, that's the United States Army. They all received medals and commendations for this. Right? This is the history that we need to tell. We're not talking about it, at least in the U.S. We're not. Believe it or not, I feel like Canada's ahead of the U.S., but we are not talking about it. I don't think any U.S. president has ever used the term genocide, but that's what this looks like to me. There's certainly evidence that Hitler looked at this. There is evidence of that. But when the Dakota Access Pipeline happens, it's not just about the environmental impact. It's the fact that their relatives are buried in this land. They ignore the archaeology reports as well. Their relatives are buried in this land. So I just think, one, these gentlemen should posthumously have their commendations revoked. And we should be talking about this. Now, I'm not saying that because I feel like we should cast blame, guilt, any of that. I just think we just need to be honest. We just need to be honest. And then it's up to us to decide as individuals what we want to do about that. We don't just say like, well, that history is bad, so let's never teach that. Some states are doing that. Through their legislative power, they're doing that. But if we're not saying these things, we'll never know these things, right? And then as Indigenous people, this is just, we know that I knew this was my history from being a child, right? And my parents were like, well, just don't think about that. But, I got to think about that. But as a designer, I just want us to tell the truth. And I just want us to be honest about it. And how do we get to the place that we are now in our relationships with the land? So it was important to me, like, I can't use this kind of imagery in the drawing. I just use the text to begin to do that. So this is an ongoing research project. And so these are the sort of form studies. So I'm really thinking about, if I were to design this university, what does that mean in the 21st century for Indigenous people to be educated in this place? And how do they get there? What is it like? The building is, to me, is an animal that has to inhabit this island in a way that is really synergistic to the land, but it also, that part of the island gets closed off to public traffic because there are birds that nest there. How can I make a building that allows that to happen too? And so that was the thing that I'm really sort of thinking about, is how does that go forward, and how do we think about that as designers? And then any one of these projects, I think any time what you're seeing is like, I'm not relying on those symbols and forms. What I am relying on are the values, the ontology, the axiology of Indigenous people, and then how can I translate those things into the form? That's where I feel like I'm trying to be a good future ancestor, and I'm trying to leave the artifacts of our culture right now. And I feel like that's the responsibility that I think we all have as designers. Yabako, thank you.
Thank you. Have a seat. I feel like you need a breather. Gosh, you've talked about so many things that I'd like to talk to you about. It's hard to figure out where to begin, from the projects to the historical account at the end. It's there are so many registers that you raised in the conversation you had with us tonight. So, but I'm going to try.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to turn it over to the audience and give them a chance at it as well. But I thought about a lot of different things today, looking at your work and listening to you this evening. And I was struck by this issue. One of the things that you brought up is the issue of naming. And I was thinking about it in relationship to the ways in which you name the community center, the spaces of the community center, the way you illustrated a different way of naming, a kind of fallen way of naming in the instance of the houses like the one that you grew up in, and how names sometimes obscure the ritual and meaningful ways in which we inhabit space, and sometimes they can summon them, and that the naming is something that it shapes our cognition. It helps us to relate to things. And I mean, I was always struck, that somehow when we teach students architecture, that sometimes, you'll find that the conversations are difficult, the language doesn't exist, but I think somehow the use of the language helps us to see. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that, because I was thinking about, again, the community center where you gave all these names to these rooms, and it was a way of, I think, summoning perceptions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's when I really started to think about this, because that was a conversation that Predoc and I had, was like, how can we make this thing as least institutional as possible? So it even like, we decided it's not just going to be a double-loaded corridor with classrooms on it. It actually finds its way through the site and negotiates the different levels, and that's when I really started to think about Indigenous naming of place. And how sophisticated that actually is. And it's not like you would say, well, school's here, church is there, or government is here, and this is where I work. And we do those things in architecture school, right? Where like, what's the project? It's a school, it's a church, it's a museum. Those are just ways of getting into the thing. But then I started to think about how the names of the things can actually, affect that way that we think about them as designers. And then the second is like how people experience them. And so what I did on that project was not only the naming of the thing, I wrote this cultural program for it that parallels the big Excel spreadsheet of all of the spaces. And what we did, part of it was there in the plan thing, we made these visual translations of values. Some of the values were like oral tradition, orientation, music, multi-generational, food, medicines. All of those, we made visual things. And then we printed them out on 3x4 acetate. We built a light box, and when we presented it to the community, we talked about the thing, and then we put it on a light box. And they overlaid each other. So the cultural program that I started to write, let's say about the theater, because all of the interviews we were doing with the users, a lot of people said, well, we think the theater should be at the entry. And then, okay, well, let's put it at the entry. But we started to think about the drum and the resonance of the drum. And we wanted people to connect that place with their homelands. So in Wisconsin, the Menominee have this place called Kashina Falls, which is really sacred to them. And the falls just kind of like do this. Like they beat on these stones for thousands of years. And they talk about that as a heartbeat. And so when they're beating a drum, they're thinking about that heartbeat. So that's what I was like, okay, we have to think about that as designers. So it's round, and we started to think about burrowing, like the seating is carved out of the earth. You step down into the thing. Like then I started to like, this is how we should be designing, right? Like, and this is the thing we want students to do too, is to have a sort of consistency of the way that we think about other things and how they translate into space. And I believe because we did that, that's why the place is Indigenous. And I can't tell you how many Indigenous people have gone to the place and said, yes, this is Indigenous space. And without any provocation or anything. So one of the mothers that had two or three sons that went to the school, she told me the story that the students there believe that there's a spirit that sits on top of the roof and watches over them and protects them. We couldn't design that. You cannot design that. You cannot design that, right? Like you can't say, well, this is where people sit, this is where you eat lunch, and then that's where the spirit sits. Like, you can't do that. But I believe it exists because the students were invested in the place. And so when they went to their classroom, they didn't say I was Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so or 135. My classroom's turtle. My classroom is sweetgrass. My classroom is sumac. Like, it's part, oh, I know what that means. And then they see the sign. It's in the 5 languages in Wisconsin. Like, all of that, just, I feel like that was coming from just understanding what the thing is called, and then how do I extend out of that and embed all of those values. What materials are we picking? Like, that was a thing too that was just so wonderful about working with Antoine, was like, this is how he already thinks. And then us working collaboratively was just like an amazing synergy that made those things happen, because he just like is an amazing architect. He knew how to make beautiful buildings. And in the clarity of architecture, I think was a thing too, because then other things didn't get in the way, like where the sprinkler heads are, the exit signs, like we thought about all of those things. So all of that had to come from that understanding of
Right.
naming and what we called things.
Right. I mean, I think that something that's happened with words like bedroom and dining room,
Yeah.
we forget that they're actually ritual words, and we think of them as designating a utility, or like a function, and they've been drained of the ritual aspect that, in fact, they really should contain. So we maybe have to use new words, even in those old-fashioned
Yes,
plans,
yes.
to recall that. And I think that you brought that a lot to mind tonight. I don't know, there's no particular order, but I was also thinking just like the much larger themes you brought up at the end also have to do with naming. I mean, an account of history is a naming of events and a naming of territories, a description, and somehow that is how I, at least for me, was making it seems to be for you, making the connection between things that might seem to be more narrowly architectural and the much larger themes that you brought up in the end. Like, how do you see the world that you inhabit by describing it, in a sense, properly with an account of history? Anyway, it's a reflection, though.
Yeah.
But I was also struck by, the sort of, I thought that the Trickster project played a particularly key role in your thinking, and I mentioned this to you before you came in here tonight, before we came in this room tonight, because Trickster is tricky. I mean, it asks you to name it. You mentioned that some of the kids who went to it came up with a variety of stories, each one of which you said, yes, that's right. But it does seem key to me that it is a quality of design that does ask for that kind of naming and maybe even narrative account, which I think is also characteristic of all of the pavilions, or I don't know if follies in a way that you made. I don't know if you want to say more about the Trickster or about this idea of, I don't know, a kind of like a summoning of stories.
Yeah, I think that the Trickster was starting to make a thing that I felt like I understood, but I couldn't articulate. So I actually talk about this. So I teach students how to draw like these Alcatraz drawings. But then I realized I can't just show you this thing and say, here, do this. But what I did was I developed a process for doing that. But all of that was part of like building this language for understanding or helping them understand it. And a big part of it, like the sort of pedagogical objective there, is like I felt like we weren't teaching students subjectivity as well as we should be. Like what you like and what you don't like, why you like it and why you don't like it. So a part of that is sort of embedded in that. But I really just started to think about that with the Trickster, because that was actually after the Columbus thing. So after I did the Columbus thing, that, to be honest, was the first. I was like, what? Why did you ask me to do this? I've never done this before. But then I just was like, this is amazing, because the installation work happens really quickly, but it's actually a thread of much deeper knowledge and understanding. So I was really just thinking about that trajectory of like idea, drawings, model, full-scale thing. And then the installation started to be the full-scale thing. For me, I feel like I have to start to turn back to the drawings and even the model. Like the model I showed was not a scalar representation of what I built. It was just embedded with the way that I was thinking about something, and then the Trickster was the opportunity to actually make that thing. But when I started writing about it, like especially for this awards thing, and like how I described it, like, no, this is actually, I don't want to write prose about this. I just want to write this in a sort of poetic way, like the Trickster is this, the Trickster is that, don't forget about this. That the Trickster then becomes the thing. It's kind of like like Kaufman movies, right, where he like writes himself into the movie. It's kind of like that, because then the character starts to speak, and then I can start to say things that I wouldn't say, But then I understood that my elders were trying to tell us things about it. And then sometimes those stories were like about someone that was listening to the story. And sometimes it was just about greater society and how you should conduct yourself. But it wasn't like in the Aesop's fables kind of thing, like don't play with fire, don't do that, this is what happens, the end. No, it's actually an open-ended thing. And that's where I was like, really, architecture can do this. Buildings can do it. I don't think just installations can do it. Two, because like I understood that it was working in the buildings, like in the Indian Community School, like that was happening. Students were making their own stories about these places and spaces and the ways that they were seeing nature, because all of that was embedded in the way that we were designing the thing. So if you notice, there's a parenthetic title of it, it's not a teepee, because when I was actually building the thing, every time anyone walked by, they said, what are you building, a teepee? No, it's not a teepee. And then the second one I made is called It's Not a Wigwam. I made that in an exhibition, in a museum space. So I was a little bit more robust with the regalia because it was inside, this thing was outside. But even that was like thinking about how I was taught about, like, well, things shouldn't be ornamental or just aesthetic. They should have a purpose. They should mean something. They should be part of the concept of party or whatever. Like all of that, I was just starting to think about how am I going to be the trickster that is now telling the story. In the trickster stories, the trickster, I won't say universally, but in some cases gets sort of found out or revealed. Like the weakness gets revealed in what they were doing. I don't know if I certainly haven't got to the point in my work yet, but I do think that what I was also thinking about is that architectural education has been so good about telling us what it is and how to do it. Here's a school, here's how you design it. Here's a museum, here's how you design it. But we haven't been talking about the why and the who. Why are we doing this and who are we doing it for? And so that's where I started to think about, well, if we started to unfold those lessons into what we're doing, we can still do the other things. They don't replace that. But in that way, each of us can be tricksters of thinking about how we leverage the projects that we have, how we leverage the budgets that we have, how we leverage our client relationships, how that client does or doesn't want to exist in the world, and then how do we reflect that back in their spatial experience of place. I think we all can be tricksters in a way in that regard. So I really did start to think about that a lot. And I was actually really compelled by, I took this Indigenous literature class in undergrad, and we learned about Gerald Visner, and he was really compelled by the trickster. And he just wrote in this way, too. You were just like, I don't know what this is. It's almost like a David Lynch film, too, right? Like, he doesn't, I think he kind of cares about narrative, but doesn't. It's like a ball he likes to kick around. And so I just thought, well, let's start doing that as architects. Like, what happens if we start to think about the world like that? Yeah.
I'm trying to think about, I have a couple more questions for you, but I just by the way, I have to say, I told Chris when I read It's Not a Teepee, he had written it as one word, and I was trying to sound it out thinking it was an Indigenous word. I feel like I should confess to that, but it's not a teepee, it's not a teepee. Then I thought, it's not a teepee. Anyway, there are two things. One thing is very narrow, more like drilled down into an architectural question, and one is like a very broad one about how we practice as architects. Maybe I will ask both, but like, I mean, I was thinking about, this, your slide of diagrams and who designs for whom, but when you were showing that, I was thinking that architects are often, well, maybe always designing for strangers, but the relationship that you that is one of colonization is also, which is like kind of a heightened version of a kind of relationship which is also typical of the relationship between the producers of architecture and those who dwell within it. I mean, sometimes, in luxury private commissions, that's a different matter, but most of the city is designed by architects and built for people who they will not likely know. And I don't know if you see that, like your insight, which has to do with the specific history of colonization, has, if you understand it, as having ramifications for how architecture is structured in relationship to people more generally.
Yeah, I think that, certainly early on in my education, I wasn't really thinking about that because I was just like, I'm learning how to do this. And then I did start to think about that. And the thing that I tell students too is just that, if you're a student, you're probably going to work for people that are not like you at all, right? Like they usually have more means than we do, right? That's how we got there. But then they may have less means, or they may have the same amount. You might have some similarities, but they're just never going to probably be like us. Right. And it doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. It's just that they're different. And so that's where that, like, if we teach empathy and how to be empathetic designers, I do think that is something that can sort of catch on and reverberate, that even if it's Nike, let's say, that hires me to do something, like I'll do it.
It's the empathy.
Right? I'll do it because I want to say something about, well, what about this corporation in the world, right? Not so much like, I'm going to tell you how bad you are. No, I want to be a designer too. But we're all sort of working in that relationship, meaning like the client-designer relationship. But we have, I think, a responsibility to educate and like, how do we bring clients along to where we are? I feel like when I was, in school in the 90s, it was like all my professors were like talking about clients like they were the enemies of good architecture. It's the client's fault I can't do this. It's the client. No, it's not. It's like you haven't figured out how to translate what they're saying and then to show them how that can be done. I do think we're living in different times for sure, but it's that understanding of empathy. I think just understanding that we're not all the same, and how do we sort of teach that? I do think that there's a lesson, at least the lesson for me when I show this research paradigm, that's just a way for me to say, yes, this is how I can think about indigeneity, but again, I'm still not getting a formula or a checklist to say these things make indigenous architecture. But if we think about that and we're thinking about how we are approaching a project, that's where this, like, I think, wonderful thing happens where the architecture just sort of becomes architecture with a capital A and like resonates with people, anyone, not just like the people that use it, but it gets understood and sort of consumed in that way. Yeah.
Even though I have more questions, I think I should give the audience a chance. So are there questions out in the audience? There's one over on the right. Does somebody have a microphone? You're getting one in a sec.
Buzu, Anin. My influences are Anishinaabe, locally. And it's a relationship question for you. You made several references to 13 regarding the museum. My Anishinaabe teachings are that 13 represents the full moons, represents the months, represents the plates on Turtle's back, so Turtle Island. Does this hold true for your design?
Yes.
Is this your thinking?
Yep.
Yeah.
Like when I was thinking about how many pieces are in this thing, there's actually, on the outside, there's 12 spots. The 13th is actually in the middle. I was thinking about that because that's the kind of thing that I want to happen, right? Like I want other indigenous people to find that for themselves and that resonates, and then that's how you see yourself in the thing. Not for me to stand up there and give you that whole lesson, like this equals this, that's why there's 13. Like I kind of stopped doing that at some point, like I used to do it. And then that was like, well, what if I didn't do it? Will people get it? And that's exactly why there's 13 things there, yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Sego. So first of all, I'm one of the Indigenous advisors here at this school. And I so appreciate your words about teaching the truth and the history. I think in my position here, it has been a really incredible journey. Our office will be 3 years old. But I arrived here, and I'm not an architect, but I ended up working with a bunch of architects. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was released to the world, suddenly there was requests for Indigenous people like myself to work on projects for Indigenous engagement, consultation. So I'm wondering what your experience has been like on projects, because what I'm noting here in the city, we have now a reconciliation action plan. There's calls to action within it. And so the RFPs that are being released are often stating you have to have an Indigenous engagement specialist and consultation. So my experience, so it's kind of two parts. So I want to know how that's working on your projects. And then I guess the other part is what I'm finding is once I'm hired by a team, the non-Indigenous architects and landscape architects and engineers and designers have no idea about the truth about Indigenous history in this country. So the bulk of my work ends up being teaching them about the history first. So I'm wondering if you can sort of speak to that.
Yeah, well, if I understand both parts, this is happening more in the U.S., but it's not as, I think, institutionalized as it kind of is here in Canada. There's not, when it comes to architecture, there's not many of us, right, to begin with. How many are there now? I don't know. I thought it was like 20 or 20. It's probably about that. I'm not licensed, I can't call myself an architect, but whatever. I'm a full professor of architecture, tenured, right, so, whatever.
Many of the best are not.
Well, talking about naming, let's not get hung up on the names. But the point is that, what I'm finding, to be honest, like most of my clients are not Indigenous. They're institutions that want Indigenous thinking, and I am very careful about the projects that I take because I don't want to just be the Indigenous guy on the team to kind of like check your box or whatever. Like I always say that I have to have a design voice in the project because if I don't, then I'm not a cultural consultant, right? I'm a designer and I have to do that. It's very easy to get caught up in that like RFP world and going around and being that. And so it's challenging for people like yourself, right? Like if you don't have architectural training, you find yourself having to try to translate for people that are speaking a different language, perhaps.
Yeah, the Indigenous communities often don't have any sense of what the architects are talking
Yes. Or they have been wronged, like my neighborhood, right? There was I don't even know if it's true, there was like, whatever the res version of urban myth is, that the architect that designed those homes is in jail right now. Like, that's what we said as kids, like, and that was the thing we understood. But that's the result of it, right? Like, that's what happens. Okay, we can, there's a need for Indigenous housing, but if you keep pumping that out, what is going to happen? I think this similar thing holds true. Now, if we talked about those things and everyone's K through 12 education, and then when they went to college, everyone has to take Indigenous history, so that when you and I are sitting down with someone, I don't have to tell you everything about it. So the work that I did when I taught a studio at Yale in the spring of 21 was Indigenous housing, and we were working in Manitoba. And this was online because it was during the pandemic, so we had to do our sort of interface with the community that way too. Like halfway through the semester, I'm like, why am I so effing exhausted? It's because I have to tell them all these things that they don't know. And I said to them, you're at Yale, and your K through 12 and your undergraduate education has failed you. It is not your fault, right? It's not your fault that you don't know these things. So if we could teach those things and not try to put just the Band-Aid on the thing, like people like us, right, that are hired to do these things, we need to fix what's happening upriver in order for us to understand, like, how can we make this water drinkable, right? That's how it needs to be understood. And that's what we have to do that's the long-term goal. At the same time, like, people should interact with Indigenous people. When I lived in Milwaukee, and I told people that, like, I could go a month without seeing another Indigenous person. And only because I had a monthly meeting at the Indian Community School. Now in Albuquerque, I can't, like, turn around without seeing an Indigenous person, right? And that's just like makes me feel good. But even like that goes the other way around, right? People just don't, if they don't interact with Indigenous people and you aren't taught these things, then what would we expect to happen? And I don't think that those things can only be structural, because in the state of Wisconsin, the K through 12 educators are required to teach Indigenous history, so they all go to one place and they get that training and they do it. Now, what you think any high schooler knows? No, they don't, right? And again, it's not their fault. So, for me at least, I have to do the work and then say, yeah, but you have to do something about that. That's why even like when I say land acknowledgement, okay, sorry this happened. Sorry I slapped you in the face or slapped your mother in the face. Okay, but now what are you going to do about that, and how are we going to go forward? And I think how we go forward is we hire people to design your campus buildings, to design your border crossing stations, to design whatever it is, because that's how we can then start to say things about place in my discipline, right, of architecture. And at the same time, I would hope that that would make your work easier, because people would have encountered something. I think it just happens better here in Canada, to be honest. It's just more, people are just more aware of it than, because we know what the U.S. did, and so they're never going to say anything about it. That's the thing. And I will tell you this. The work that I'm showing you, I showed people 10, 15 years ago. They didn't give a shit about it. The Architecture League of New York didn't give a shit about it. And then they asked me to be on their jury, right? So I tell my students, that's where you want to be. You want to make a career for yourself where they're asking you to judge the thing that you didn't get, right? That's how good you want to be. That's the thing. But that's where I have seen the awareness change, right? And so I think it's a big deal that Canada said our pavilion at the Venice Biennale is going to be all Indigenous architects. And we're going to forget about the border, and we're going to have people like myself and Glenn and Tamara and Wanda, like people that are practicing in the U.S. to be a part of that too, because we don't see it that way. Like, those are really big steps, right? Those are really important things. I will just sort of, this is my empathy with you. This is hard for me to do, right? As a human being, to talk about these things. Why is it our responsibility, right? It's not easy. And so anyone, and I think any student of color, any student, like, if you want to make an impact in your world, you should do that, but you should understand that it is heavy lifting. And you have to be okay with putting that stuff in the backpack and keep going. Because if you say that the backpack's too heavy and put it down, it's not going to happen, right? That's where the generation from now, 2 generations from now, I hope we're in a better place. Because if we don't do the work now, we won't be. And our parents couldn't. They couldn't. Yeah. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I wonder if you could say a few words about your teaching and your leadership at the University of New Mexico, in particular about perhaps welcoming and trying to ensure the thriving of Indigenous students in your community. Well,
fortunately, the good problem I have is I don't have to try to recruit in a way, because we just got our census numbers that give us all the demographics. 9% of our undergrad is Indigenous and 6% of our grad is Indigenous. I am a little concerned about the third drop, the 30% drop, but I don't have to like recruit them. What I would love is for them to come talk to me. Like, I'm the only Indigenous chair of any architecture program right now, I think. They don't, and I won't like drag them, right? So, but what I will do is I'll get in front of the whole school and talk about these things, like, so that they know, okay, well, someone understands that. But that's the beauty of that particular place, is that I don't have to convince anyone that these things are important, because then in some ways I don't have to teach these kinds of histories because they understand it. When I was in Wisconsin, I was like, I got tired of it. This is tired. And so that, but when I say that, when I'm talking to faculty, I'm like, how are you integrating this into, and they were kind of already doing that in our architectural history, in our building technology courses. In every course, there's usually some opportunity for these students, and they're just amazing because they, of any other place, they just have knowledge of that place because that's where they're coming from. That is so valuable, and so we try to figure out how do we get them to think about it. Like, you have to write an essay in your history class that's about where you're from, just so that you know how to do that and how to talk to people about that. It's really amazing to be in a place that happens, but I think for me the larger goal is like, how do I help spread that, right? So I taught at Yale in 21, I taught at Columbia in this past spring. I'm going to go back to Yale because those places value what I have to offer, and these non-Indigenous students, I am very clear with them about, like, this is what we're going to learn. This is, I start with these things that you're reading, things that aren't architectural, but how do we translate them? But I would hope that there's more of that happening. I will say that my concern right now, I don't know if I want to even call it a concern, but sort of what I'm cognizant of is, as an administrator, it's my job to hire people, hire the faculty. I don't see Indigenous people as educators. They're practitioners, so I have like Tamara Bigay, who's amazing practice in Albuquerque. She's always there. I got another Indigenous woman that teaches in our second year undergrad, but those are part-time faculty. Like, where are the people like myself and David Forten and Patrick Stewart? Like, we're educators too. So we can't force anyone to do that, but that's like a thing that I'm aware of. Like, how can I make that happen? I don't know. I would hope it happens. Thanks.
There's a question in the back.
Hi, my question kind of builds off what Robert Levitt said about naming and how that shapes cognition. So I feel like though we as students can draw parallels or alignments, at least in the formal aspects of Indigenous architecture and architecture that's kind of like knowledgeable of that. And I guess that's like an example of that would be skylights and sky holes. But how would learning other Indigenous stories or names for words used in both architecture school and practice differently affect students compared to professionals in becoming empathetic designers?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, because it's easy, right, to say, well, Indigenous people put the entry on the east. As an architect, I can do that, right? Or, yeah, I need a view of the sky. I can do that. Or a place for a fire. I can do that. But it's really about understanding the value systems, like what is valuable, and then how do I translate that? And don't just rely on symbol, material, form to do that, meaning like this building stands for indigeneity, which is the duck, right? And the decorated shed, where I say, oh, that iconography is there. Let me put this on this building. Like, it came from an Indigenous blanket or pottery, and I can put it on the building. Well, yeah, we gravitate towards those things because they're so easy. The harder things are like, how do I begin to think about space as a designer where it will be a great space from hundreds of years of architectural education? Yeah, we can do that. But how do we then start to pull these pieces together, right? Like, that's the thing. So what I realized or discovered as a graduate student, because my thesis project was a cultural center for my tribe, I was like wrestling with this thing, and I just decided there's no one building that is going to encapsulate this culture. Like, I cannot, it's not possible. But what if I start to take certain aspects of it, and what are those things that are important to me? And then how do I make the space for those things? I think that's true of any culture, to be honest. Like, if you take away the symbols and the icons, like, what are you really left with? So that we don't always just rely on those things. That's where the naming comes in, right? It's like, how do I understand the space? And then when I name it, like, how does that change the way that people sit in the place, or how it gets used, or how one understands it? And I try to be so integral that people won't think about it. Because to me, too, like, if someone goes into the Indigenous ceramics thing and they don't count the lights and they don't see it, well, there's 13 of these things. Okay, but I hope you had a good experience in that space. That's where what we learn as architects is like, that's valuable. And that's where we can sort of intervene in the world, right? And if we're doing it with the responsibility of trying to communicate cultures and the values of those cultures, that's where I think we're starting to push things forward. And that's what I'm trying to do. Certainly not every Indigenous architect is. I don't judge anyone, but just how I chose to do it, right? Like, that's for me, that's what's important. Yeah, thank you.
Chris, I think we're going to wrap up. It's a great conversation. I feel like it'll be fun to keep going, but we should eat. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight and participating in the evening. And I don't want to break the spell, but we do have another lecture coming up. I'll just let you know, the Zeidler-Evans lecture, which is going to be given by Diana Anderson. If any of you know her, otherwise known as the Docatect, deals with medicine and architecture, health and architecture, and Molly Chan, and our faculty's own Stephen Verderber, and they're going to be talking about designing for older people in a transforming world. That'll take place on October 17th at 6:30. But Chris, thank you so much for coming.
My
tonight.
pleasure.
Great. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.